Hey everybody, happy Sunday. I am inside because my neighborhood is good and loud this evening, and it wasn't going to be conducive to a decent bourbon talk. So we're indoors. I hope you'll forgive me. Cheers to everyone. We just made through a week that, God, felt like a month isn't right. 2 months isn't right. Let's go with a month and a half. So cheers. It's been an especially no flannel. It's hot down in southern Georgia all of a sudden. It was cool there for a minute, and it felt like uh, maybe like a real fall, a real early fall was coming in, and then immediately it gets back up to like 87 today. It was such a tease, and it's so upsetting. I'm a fall person. I've talked about this in the muckrake sort of like get-togethers and hangouts. Like I'm a total autumnal guy. I want to wear a flannel. I want to wear boots. I want to have a light jacket. That's what I want. Maybe a little bit of a drizzle. Yeah, I've had to turn the AC back on. Terrible. And it was like one of those things where it was like things are frustrating enough already without having like fall taken away from me. It has been exhausting the past week or so. And I'm sure it has been for you as well. It's been a combination of things, but I was talking about this on Twitter the other day. Fascism is all about dragging you through your own trauma and giving you the gaslighting treatment, where on one hand, like you have, I don't know, a president of the United States who lies to you constantly about everything from his health to how a pandemic is going. Meanwhile, the pandemic is just back in full swing again. And then as a culture, unfortunately, we're also facing this thing where we've been in this for so long that now people are just sort of numb to it. Like it's exhausting to know that this is like killing people, upwards of 900 people a day, and and then meanwhile people aren't taking it seriously, or they're underplaying it, or all of this stuff. It's so exhausting, and I'm sure you're exhausted too. So I'm happy that we are here. I'm glad that we're hanging out tonight. As always, cheers again. I wanted to talk for a second about something that occurred this week. Of course, the plot that was foiled to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, and this is another one of those things that it's absolute madness. We live in a country where a white terrorist cell was planning on uh, kidnapping a governor in the United States of America, taking her across state lines to Wisconsin, I believe, where they were going to hold a trial. Which I just want to point out real fast that this idea of them holding a trial, I think that's really, really important. The idea that they felt like that they were invested with some sort of sovereignty to hold that trial, that these men were somehow or another of a level that they could take a governor hostage and then hold her trial and probably execute her. And of course, in part, they were inspired by Donald Trump telling them to liberate the state. But it's also something, unfortunately, that we've dealt with multiple times in this country. Uh, Going back to the very beginning of this country and throughout, we have had one terrorist organization and one white supremacist fascistic uprising after another. I was writing about this the other day, how the Confederate States of America was a white terrorist organization, the Ku Klux Klan after it, all of these mobs and militias that went after African Americans, particularly in the early 20th century, claiming that they were, communist traitors and terrorists and all of that. And then into the 1990s, of course, which it's interesting. Every now and then, I'm starting to hear like a little flitter of people saying, the name Timothy McVeigh, which is a name that we really need to know more We really need to discuss it more. This idea that there are white supremacists who believe that the country has been taken over, that there are, conspiracies between, obviously they think that Jewish people, liberal traders, and people of color who are being manipulated are attacking this country and that they need to be treated like enemies and terrorists. And our media just sucks talking about it. It's a momentary thing. With McVeigh, they talked about it as if he was just an isolated lone wolf, which is what we always say about white people who commit these terroristic actions. We have groups of people who, we have radicalized young white men who go into stores and in public spaces and mass murder God knows how many people. And then we talk about their mental illness, and we talk about how they had been radicalized by the things that they read or whatever, but we never ever talk about the fact that these things are all interconnected, and it's all based on the paranoia and the insecurity of white supremacy, which is only achievable. This white supremacist idea of manipulation and control, it's only achievable if you keep people intimidated and oppressed through violence and propaganda. It's a big giant problem that we're not going to fix or even start to deal with unless we start to look in the mirror and recognize that white supremacy in this country has been a problem from the very beginning, and it has poisoned us and brought us to this moment. The first question I have is from Kravit Quizby. It says, militia versus terrorist has been a fun semantic this week. It absolutely has been. And this is indicative of exactly what we're dealing with. We have a group of people who they not only wanted to kidnap a governor, they wanted to probably execute a governor. And they were hoping, as we've talked about on here and we've talked about on the Muckrake podcast and I talked about in American Rule, we have a group of people that wanted to bring about a new civil war. What they want to do is they want to destabilize the United States of America. They want to bring it to the point where this destabilization creates chaos and anarchy that they can sweep in and take control of. There's a reason why they have arsenals. There's a reason why they've prepared for a doomsday. Some preppers prepare because they want to survive in their basements. Others prepare because they want to go out in the streets and they want to enforce their will and they want to take over. That's what these people wanted to do. In a sane country, you wouldn't have these people. But in a sane country, if something like this was uncovered, you would take this as a moment of reflection. You would take this as a moment of reckoning. I saw something, I forget who the group was. I want to say it was like ABC or like a local ABC or something like that. It was like, we're not going to refer to them as a militia anymore. We're going to refer to them as white terrorists. We have to start looking through the lens that white supremacy breeds radicalization because it is such a mess. And Monday, you're exactly right, is it challenges the master narrative of the United States of America. That's the biggest problem, is that we have to start troubling that narrative. We have to, because if we don't, we are going to be trapped in this alternate reality, and these fascist and white supremacists are going to drag us into the abyss. Period. It's just, those are the stakes. There's no other way to put it. There's no plainer language to use. We have to escape that narrative or else we're in real trouble. And this right here, I don't know about the rest of you. This week, we're a couple weeks out from the election, obviously. And we'll talk about the election, obviously. I thought maybe eventually the media would kind of learn its lesson. And then today, of course, I told everybody this, that there was going to be this thing about Joe Biden that was going to pop up in the next couple of days. Pompeo's out there talking about Hillary Clinton's emails. Now, all of a sudden, the big topic du jour on all of the Sunday shows, and by the way, all the Sunday shows can just go to hell because they're nothing except for spectacle peddling. That's all they are. Yeah, we got to talk about Michael Lee at some point. Absolutely, we got to talk about him. But now all of a sudden it's like, will Joe Biden pack the court? Maybe this is something we should talk about as a country. And it's like, listen, you have a president of the United States of America who's told everyone who will listen to him that he doesn't plan on accepting the results of the election unless he wins. He has an entire operation set in place to undermine our entire presidential election. And meanwhile, you're talking about packing the court, which is absolutely something that a president can do. and with the help of Congress that they can do. So I'm frustrated. I'm glad that some people have started waking up about the idea of white supremacy, but my God, it's just this system, the way that it is set up and the way that it is structured, is not conducive to a country that works. And these people, unfortunately, they have to be saved from themselves. Media members, pundits, politicians, they can't get it. They don't understand. They either don't understand what we're dealing with, or they are in such denial and they are so held captive by terror, or they're profiting off of it. Those are the three things. And it's a lot. It's absolutely a lot. But I am very glad. I'm glad somebody said something about Michael Lee. I am so glad that Michael Lee said what he did about democracy, because we've gotten to the point, and my co-host on the Muckrake podcast says this all the time, Nick Hauselman. He says, I'm really happy that they've gotten to the point where they don't even have to hide it anymore, that they just say out loud what they feel and what they think. And this idea that democracy is a problem and that democracy will destroy us is something that the Republican Party truly and honestly believes. They think that America should be run by an elite, white, wealthy group of people. They don't actually think everyone should vote. There's a reason why they've gerrymandered everything. There's a reason why they disenfranchise. There's a reason why they're destroying democratic institutions. And we'll talk more about why they're doing it and how they're doing it here in a minute. But yeah, it's they need to understand that this group is an anti-democratic movement. They have nothing to do with actual politics. Politics is about going out there and convincing people that your idea is right and giving them facts and then giving them your interpretation and figuring out a way to come to some sort of consensus or something approaching a consensus. That's not what the Republican Party is a part of. And they are run through with it and they are terminal with it. Aaron says, just finished American Rule tonight. Fantastic read. Thank you, Aaron. I appreciate that. Cheers. We're in that weird spot with American Rule where it's been out for long enough that people are starting to finish it. And it's been really cool hearing from people who have gotten their way through it and receiving those messages. I would love to hear from you. If you have finished American Rule, you want to talk about it, I would love to hear from you. That would just make my day. But Aaron says, do you see any drastic changes on where the two parties line up on the political spectrum moving forward? And if so, what will bring that on? So we're in a weird spot. As I talked about in American Rule, and as I've talked about on Twitter, the Democratic Party in the 1980s and the 1990s realized that Ronald Reagan had more or less won the messaging war by embracing the idea of American exceptionalism and not really dealing with America's problems. There weren't actual conversations about what was going on in America. It was a denial that America had any problems. And so Reaganism, which was just presenting the idea of an exceptional America without any questioning or without any observation or deeper scrutiny, the Democratic Party realized that they had to go that way and that they had to embrace what you would call free market principles. Well, almost immediately in the 1990s, when the Democratic Party basically moved to the right and sort of embraced this idea of becoming Republican light, the Republicans moved even further right. And they started calling the Democrats like socialist and leftist and liberals, even as they were coming to a point where they accepted what they believed and what they were pushing. It could have been a moment where this country could have existed at the center or at the center right with the possibility of some center left. But of course, we've moved further right because the Republican Party has continually moved further right as they've narrowed their idea of what they can win and how they can win. Well, I'll give you an example of something that is the really, really weird thing that's happening. The other day, Pete Buttigieg went on Fox News, and he's been going on there for the past couple of weeks. And Pete Buttigieg goes on, and a reminder, this is like an openly gay veteran young man from Indiana who embraces free market principles and talks about basic human decency. And he's never been my candidate. I wouldn't vote for him unless he was up against Donald Trump or a Republican or whatever. But he goes on Fox News and he tells Fox News where they're going wrong and why they're acting like hypocrites and why they should, embrace their principles more and actually like talk about these things from like the Republican standpoint. In a sane country, Pete Buttigieg would be like the Republican front runner. He would be the most popular Republican there was. They would be talking about the principles. but they don't care about their principles. What they are is a white identity fascistic movement. They're only interested in power. And if you saw it, by the way, this video of McConnell just cackling like a crypt keeper about how he stole a bunch of judge seats, and that's what they're about. And Mike Lee over here talking about being anti-democracy and all of that. That's who they are. So right now, what we're seeing is that we're watching a bunch of Republicans sort of jump off the ship. Like, they recognize that it's like the Titanic. It's starting to take on water. It's starting to sink into the fascistic abyss. Meanwhile, you obviously have a group of Republicans who are delusional, and they still believe that Donald Trump is perfect, and they're starting to believe in QAnon, which we'll talk about what that might look like in the future. Meanwhile, a bunch of Republicans are jumping off the ship. I never in my life thought that I would agree on a presidential candidate with Will Kristol or Bill Kristol, whatever you want to call him today. This is a person who did more to hurt healthcare in this country than anybody else. The Project Lincoln guys, who, by the way, have been running ads to hurt Democrats and smear liberals unfairly for decades and use racism and misogyny and white supremacist paranoia, even they are like, oh, this is gross. I don't want to be a part of this. And they're coming to the left. And they're starting to make a bid for the Democratic Party. Because the truth is that the Democratic Party is such a large umbrella at this point that everybody who's a part of the Democratic Party, it's just Americans who kind of recognize what reality is at this point. Everybody else is over here on that ship, and the ship is going down. It's going down fast. And they're looking around. They're like, I don't believe we're sinking. I don't believe we're sinking either. How can we be sinking if we don't believe we're sinking? And what's going to happen there? The longer that this goes on, they're going to keep going right. I mean, they're already sitting there endorsing vigilante killings in the street. We've had round-the-clock Fox News 24 hours a day talking about white paranoia, the New World Order, conspiracy theories. And now all of a sudden, there is this moment where, Fox News isn't even far enough right for these people. Like, they cut their teeth on the Tea Party, which, by the way, was the radicalization of the Republican Party and this belief in conspiracy theories and white identity politics at all cost. Now Fox News isn't far enough for these people. So we're going to end up in a point where after this election, whether or not Donald Trump wins, loses, gets dragged out as he cries, or whatever in the hell happens, I mean, you're going to have things like OANN or a Trump network or whatever this thing ends up becoming. There's going to be something that drags it further right. The hope is the QAnon is absolutely the next Tea Party. It absolutely is. It's the next step in the cultization of the Republican Party. So there's the question, is what does that end up looking like? It's a death cult. We've already gotten glimpses of it. And now we're seeing it every couple of days, right? Or we're getting a clip maybe once a day. It's going deep. And I have to tell you that until that party goes away and it's replaced by something else. And again, like going back to like the Project Lincoln people, good luck. Go and form the alternative. Call yourself the Lincolns. Call yourself the Lincoln Party. Whatever you want to do. Like, take over and become some sort of alternative to this madness. And let's have conversations about tax cuts. Let's have conversations about free market principles and what these things are. But in the meantime, we need to get rid of this poison, and they need to go away. They should not be trusted with the reins of government. They don't live in anything approaching reality. They live in a cult. And that's why they have to go away. And the Republican Party needs to go the way of the Federalist Party and the Whigs and create some sort of new conservative party. But the question is, how does that happen? When does it happen? And does it happen? Right? Like, is there a possibility that we're going to get away from this thing? And of course, we have a lot of things that we have to deal with. We have a lot of issues that we have to deal with. Chi-Town, question from a session. What does it take to get a post-white power Republican Party? Conservatives and other multi-ethnic countries seem to have pivoted to this more effectively. They absolutely have. I mean, the Republican Party is like one of the most radical anti-reality based parties in the world. And especially considering it's in the United States of America, it makes it even more disturbing. If you actually go back to 2012, I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with this, but there's this famous autopsy report in the Republican Party after Barack Obama, handedly won re-election. And the Republicans get together and they're like, we have to abandon this white identity stuff and we need to get rid of our anti immigration ideas. And we need to start embracing the idea of a pluralistic society. We need to start talking about immigration reform. We need to start talking about, bringing more people in and sort of getting rid of the bigotry at the heart of the party. Well, they tried that with people like Marco Rubio, right? Marco Rubio got out there and tried to do this thing. And of course, Jeb tried to do it as well. And Donald Trump steamrolled them. And the reason that they steamrolled them is you can't just stomp on the brakes after decades of paranoid white supremacist appeals. So the question is, how do we get past it? I don't think the Republican Party gets past it. I really don't. I don't think that they pull themselves out of this tailspin. I think eventually you have to have enough people, and this is a gross thing to talk about, but it's true. It has to reach the point where the brand or the business of the Republican Party loses all of its appeal. It bottoms out. It hits the absolute bottom floor of this thing. And my God, would I love if that happened in November. That would be wonderful. And so if that were to happen and they were to bottom out and they're never going to have support again and like they've lost all their cultural cachet, then the Republican Party can go away and we can have a conservative alternative. But until then, they understand that the Electoral College, gerrymandering, the Senate, the media conglomerates that they've created, this alternate reality that they've constructed, they've got so much infrastructure set up in the pursuit of this, in these appeals. They would have to have a huge reckoning about their electoral chances. And I don't see them doing that right now. That's the problem. They really, really have to get there. Sarah says, what about an alternative to the Democratic Party since they're basically Republicans now? I think what we're going to see with the Democratic Party over the next couple of years is I think with the generational shift, and this is something we see all the time with the Democratic Party. They have like a really interesting history where there's sort of an establishment Democratic Party, and then there's a younger generation that sort of comes along, and they have a small civil war. They go back and forth. Most of the time, the establishment wins. Occasionally, you'll see the insurgents sort of gain power or something like that. We saw that in 2008 with Barack Obama. He was not expected to become the candidate. It just so happened that he was the right man at the right moment. I think regardless of what ends up happening in November, like whether Joe Biden wins or whether Joe Biden loses, I think we're going to see a reckoning within the Democratic Party. And part of it is that we're dealing with a generational shift. So I think that you're probably going to see, and this actually ties in with the earlier question, I think the Democratic Party over the next couple of years is going to face a couple of big concerns and challenges. The idea of democratic socialism is really, really, Monday, I see that. I'll answer that in a second. I think I think the democratic socialist idea has started to take on some power. And I also think that the next generation really is not into dichotomous ideas. Like a lot of them are independents. They don't want to say I'm this or I'm that because they like to be a lot of different things, or they like to shift depending on the day. So I think you're actually going to see the Democratic Party, particularly after this election, go through its own growing pains and have its own sort of a reckoning. And the establishment of the Democratic Party, and I wrote about this in American Rule, in the 1980s and in the 1990s, in order to combat the Republican Party, they started, flirting with corporate donors. They started dealing with, more wealthy people who could give them more money. They started dealing with think tanks, all of these, special groups. Well, the idea now is that doesn't feel very authentic. And that's actually one of the problems that they have is that brands or whatever you want to call them, they now have to seem authentic. They can't seem planned. They can't seem canned. They can't seem scripted. And so one of the things I think we're going to see with the Democratic Party is I think that challenge is going to be a lot more off the cuff. And I think someone like Ocasio-Cortez has shown us what that feels like. It's a more human sort of politics. Whether you agree with what her positions are or you don't, you can recognize that these are like different species of politics. They feel different. They hit a different chord. And I think the Democratic Party is looking at a real change coming on, and what form that's going to take and how it sort of presents itself moving forward. That's going to be really, really interesting. Monday says in the chat, do I see the Fox pundits sticking with supporting Trump if he loses, or will they jump ship? I think that if he loses, I think you probably are going to see Trump either I was getting ready to say possibly get a show on Fox News, but I think their battles have left some scars. So I assume that whether it's Trump TV or OANN or whatever, he'll probably have like a once a week show or a once a night show where he basically plays president and yells at the president. Fox News, I assume that if he goes to a competitor, that they're not going to, worship him any longer. Because one of the things that's going on is the Republican Party is splintering. We still have so many Republicans who held their nose to vote for Trump and accepted the white supremacy that he brought along. But man, there are a lot of people. There are a lot of people who don't want anything to do with him. And then the cult that is shrinking in size but gathering in intensity, those people are going to stick around and they're going to follow Trump wherever he goes. So Fox is always going to jump wherever they need to go. They showed you this with George W. Bush. You don't see a lot of W on Fox News. You don't hear them talking about W a lot. And that was where, they made their nut. That's where they gained all of their power, and their influence was in the lead up to the Iraq War. And they supported that thing full-throatedly, and they treated George W. Bush as if he was some sort of savior and a crusader in chief. And now they don't talk about him. They're a business. And so they'll go where the business is. And Donald Trump is not going to be where the business is, although he will have his own market niche. That's what Trump is going to have. It's Trumpism, and we're going to talk about that in a second. It's going to go where it is. Wildebeer says, I've been wondering if a capitalist anti-racist coalition might form to either bring the Republicans back from the brink. It could be a way for moneyed interests to get things done without being tainted by the crazies in blue states where the R's are no longer viable. I think this is an interesting idea, but I think we're already seeing a form of this with corporatism. This idea of the anti-racist, corporatist, or capitalist, it's already happening. So this is a hard thing to talk about, but it's necessary to understand to really understand what's going on in our country. Corporations don't give a shit about wokeness. They don't care about liberalism. They don't care about ideology. I've called this post-political thought, that when you reach a certain point of power and wealth, you're not really ideological. You're more about making what you want in terms of your profit and your power happen. Post-political means that you kind of want to move beyond elections. You don't really want to be part of I think Patagonia is like one of those that actually does. But there's so many of them that it's all about presenting this idea of wholesomeness or liberalism. I say this all the time. This is an example I use. Nike, who exploits people around the world and has contributed to climate change and consumerism and the atomization of society and all of this stuff, they've been a really problematic company, right? They pay a few $1 million to Colin Kaepernick, and suddenly everyone's like, oh, that company's woke. Then all of a sudden it's like dumb shit like Steakums on Twitter and things like that. And what you're actually seeing is you're seeing that the corporate world, the wealthy in this country, understand that they have to hide their post-political nature or their exploitation, and they can do it by appealing to the consumer interest for the projection of self. So like you and I always project ourselves in a certain way, like how we want to be perceived. I mean, just to be straight up honest, this is a thing that I talk about like in my classes all the time. It's like, I didn't just end up in this seat, in this room. Like so much of what you're seeing right now is how I'm presenting myself to you and how I want you to see me. Edward Bernays, I talked about this in American Rule too, who is the nephew of Sigmund Freud, talks so much about this sort of unconscious need to express yourself and how consumerism allows that to happen. And by the way, like I've got books in the background right now. And if you looked around my house, you would just see books everywhere. I do love having books. But Bernays said, you know how you sell bookshelves, how you sell books, is you make people believe that by having books around them, all of a sudden it makes them intelligent and people understand it. And so one of the things that is happening in corporate America is they're bringing in anti-racist experts, right? They're buying these anti-racist books. They're making their employees read them. They're bringing them in for seminars. And there has become a big, giant industry of what you would call wokeness or anti-racism. All of that stuff is actually a camouflage for these corporations. So like you would say, well, you know what, like you don't really have any people of color working in your corporation, and I've also noticed that you don't have a lot of women in power. And they're like, how dare you, we just had an anti-racist presentation the other day. It's a way to pay money to present this idea to the people. And they do this all the time. They want you to buy their products because they understand that your politics are like a really strong way to appeal to you, to have you buy their things. Because if you buy their things and you show it to the world, it says something about you and it says something about them, but they don't mean it. So this whole idea of like the capitalist anti-racist thing, it's already happening. And one of the reasons it's happening is because they understand that the Republican Party is toxic and poisonous and nauseating. The reason why they're not engaging in politics is they don't believe politics work anymore. They've been destroyed. Our politics have been disabled on purpose. Like there's a reason why our Congress doesn't pass laws. They don't fix problems. They don't react to crises. The president of the United States has been turned into a walking, talking joke of a mascot. So instead of engaging in politics, what they're engaging is they're engaging in the politics of capitalism, where you vote with your money and you vote with your patronage. And so one of the things that we have to do is we have to start sort of sorting the difference between what we would call liberalism or wokeness or any of those things, the performance of it and the reality of it. We have to start holding ourselves accountable, and we have to start holding other things accountable. Because one of the things that ends up happening is we start celebrating what you would call a cultural win versus a political win. We need to win the presidency. We need to do something about the Supreme Court. We need to make sure that basic human rights are there. We need to make sure that corruption is reined in. Who gets cast in the next movie doesn't matter. It's just something that makes us feel like we've won, the same way that it makes Republicans feel like they've won when Donald Trump upsets liberals. So what we have to actually start talking about is achievable things. We have to start making tangible political realities as opposed to reveling in what sneaker we buy or what t-shirt we wear or whether or not our heroes are put on like a tote bag, right? That's something that we saw with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She got turned into a product. She was a cultural icon and she got turned into a product at the end of her life. It's such a weird thing. And when you actually start studying how capitalism and hyper-capitalism work, and I just did an interview with, I don't know if you all listen, there's a really good podcast called Nostalgia Trap. I just did an interview. I think it's coming out this week. We talked a lot about this idea. So keep an eye out for that. Capitalism and hyper-capitalism work so well for themselves, not for us, because we've been juiced of all of our basic human decency by these people and we've been exploited by these people. But it works so well because what it actually does is it takes everything that threatens it and then absorbs it and resells it to you. And so what you end up doing is you start applauding things that don't really matter or aren't about changing the conversation. Instead, you start celebrating things where you're winning within the system that has exploited you and is exploiting other people. I talk about this all the time, the idea of artificial austerity. We live in a situation where our resources are all pushed towards military industrial hegemonic projects, or, we're paying taxes and the quote unquote billionaire president of the United States is paying $750. Like our money is being taken away and we're being told that this is how it works. And unfortunately, we can't afford healthcare and education and infrastructure and basic human projects. And instead, what we end up doing is we start fighting amongst ourselves over those scraps. We deserve better and we can have better, but we have to move beyond performative wokeness and we have to move towards the idea of actually being better. We have to actually work to make the world better as opposed to reveling in these sort of signifier victories. And it really, really sucks. Really sucks. Stephanie asked, what's been the best and the worst part about American rule being in the world? Thanks for the question. I appreciate that. I would say, Sebastian, I just saw this. I'll answer that in a second. I would say that the best part is hearing from people who are reading it. when I wrote American Rule, I found enough stuff that just shocked me constantly that I wore me out really figuring out like how this country worked and how we'd gotten to this point. It's really nice to see people having those conversations and realizing like what that information has done and maybe how it's illuminated certain things for people. If you haven't yet, I hope you read it. It's the closest thing I understand to the truth of how America has gotten to this point. The worst part of it being out there has been the, like accompanying harassment. People don't like it when you start troubling the white supremacist, American exceptionalist mythology. Every time that the book gets mentioned or, it gets shared or, maybe a few copies get sold or I'm doing these American Rule lectures, a new episode of that comes out, the harassment spikes through the ceiling because these people depend on this mythology and anyone who troubles it, anyone who questions it, they have to try and intimidate and frighten and scare. And if that doesn't work, they'll dole out violence, right? So it's been some pretty nasty harassment here and there, but it's nothing that I'm not used to. And I knew that it was coming. Like I've been in this gig now for, oh my God, 4 years. That's a long time. I've been in this gig for 4 years. I know how this works. I know when this stuff takes off. So at this point, like the harassment, it's just sort of water. It just goes around me. But that's been the worst part. Sebastian says, there any validity to Puerto Rico becoming a state? It should. It should be a state. This old idea that the American empire, that there are people who shouldn't be, they shouldn't have self-representation. It's just such bullshit. The American hegemonic project of, going into these other countries and making sure that people aren't able to, have votes and they're not able to determine their own destiny. Like they should have been a state a long time ago. Washington, D.C. should have been a state a long time ago. The Democratic Party is so afraid of being seen as being manipulative or playing hardball that they're absolutely terrified to even do the right thing. These places deserve to be states. Absolutely. Guam, American Samoa, they should be states. They absolutely should be. And all of the arguments that people are making that they shouldn't be states are the exact same things and the exact same arguments they made against places like Hawaii. It's white supremacist, American exceptional bullshit. Yeah, it's so bad. Hey, thank you, David. I'm so glad that you enjoy The Man They Wanted Me to Be. That was a hard book to have out in the world. Still is. It's really, really, really weird. So weird. Ugh. Libra voting. Hey, another Libra. Libras, everybody. Have we been this divided since the Civil War? We have and we haven't. There's a couple of things happening with this. In the 1960s and the 1970s, of course, we have like the counterculture movement and we have the wars between, the state and the people. And of course, we had like the FBI infiltrating these groups. And you had armed right wing people out attacking protesters and just incredible moments. I mean, like if you actually go back and look at the history of the 60s and 70s, it's not just riots in the street, COINTELPRO, all of that stuff, but it's also like there are bombings. You know what I mean? And Americans started splintering a little bit there. And the 1970s had like a very, very quiet sort of like separation of mythologies, right? All of a sudden you have left America, right America, traditional America, counterculture America, all that other stuff. The difference here is that you have in Donald Trump, and Sarah, I got your question. I'm going to get to that because I think that's something we have to talk about. I think the difference here is that Donald Trump is more than willing to take this as far as it goes. I mean, he's desperate and to maintain power. He's different than nearly anybody else going back to the Civil War, which was this period of time where all of a sudden these parts of Americans, these parts of America, the Americans started seeing themselves as different people. And of course, you had people within the South who saw an economic and political advantage to pushing that idea, right? They saw that there was an advantage to saying, that's one America, we're the real America, and now we're going to create our own country. And we don't, and I talked about this in American Rule too, I didn't understand it before I did the research of it, but like they literally believed that they were the real America and that they were going to maintain the history of the United States of America through the Confederacy. The problem here is that Donald Trump is more than willing to push us to the point of civil war. He is so narcissistic and fascistic and authoritarian in nature. It's just it's just who he is. It's where he comes from. It's how he sees the world. I doubt, and we'll talk more about this with a question, I doubt he even understands it, right? It's in his gut. And also, by the way, there is there's a real possibility that we might have a special guest on the Muckrake podcast this week. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I'm really hoping, knock on wood, that this works out. I think it's going to be really special if it works out. But I think this is intuitively who he is, and it's his nature. That's who he is and how he operates. And the fact that Donald Trump is in charge of this, and because the Republican Party is a white identity fascistic movement, because of those things, this is a perfect fertile ground. Oh, and also the media, the way that it is set up, and the way that our economy now works, and the fact that America's a failing nation right now because of all the choices we've made and all of our history and all the stuff leading up to here. This is a perfect tinderbox. It really, truly is. So I think we're more divided since the 1960s, 1970s. But if you then go back to the Civil War, there's all of these different sort of things. The Muckrake podcast comes out on Tuesday morning and Friday morning. If this special guest works out, this should be the one that is on Friday morning. Knock on wood. I really hope this works out. End 45 says, in your most recent American Rule lecture, you talked about the founding as a white supremacist aristocratic project. What do you think it would do if more people understood this? Yeah, if you haven't already, so I have this new weekly lecture series. So I'm a professor, and I really love getting on like a whiteboard, which is nice. I don't know why. I just had this whiteboard installed in my house like way before the pandemic started. I like getting on there and like sort of doing some stuff. The second episode is out talking about the founding and the Cold War. I didn't know how to like edit videos, so now it's got like graphics. I was pretty excited about that. It took way too long to figure out how to do it. Yeah, that's how I spent my birthday, was learning how to like edit those graphics and stuff. Anyway, if you haven't already, I hope that these things are a decent way to sort of explain to people how things work and, how, sort of like put it in a more sort of accessible way and get a little bit more in the weeds than I do in Twitter. So in this case, I think that if more people understood that the founding was an aristocratic white supremacist project, I think that does a couple of things. One, the founding fathers should not be considered deities. It's stupid. They're not perfect. As a matter of fact, they were very flawed men. They were hierarchical. They were white supremacists. They were misogynist. They held slaves, all this stuff. And I think that by understanding that the founding fathers were problematic individuals who were able to do a couple of things that were laudable, all of a sudden it means that we can do things that are laudable because we're flawed. My God, I'm flawed. I assume you're flawed. Like, the fact that we're flawed doesn't mean that we can't do good things. It doesn't mean that we can't make things better. And that's the second thing that it does. When you understand that America started as a white supremacist aristocratic project, that means you can change things. That means that you can start to work for these things. Thurgood Marshall talks about that all the time, or talked about that. It's almost a Donald Trump moment, right? More and more people are giving him credit. This idea that America was not perfect at its conception. It's the idea that America needs work. And instead, if you're lost in that mythology that it's perfect, well, then that means that you can't even critique it, right? And I'm sure